It was Christmas Eve, and the streets of Michigan were silent under a thick layer of snow. The cold wind howled softly through the deserted roads, but Mary Harper barely noticed. She sat hunched on a frozen bench, her 9-year-old son, Ethan, wrapped tightly in her thin coat, asleep in her arms. Her breath came out in shaky clouds as she whispered to herself, "Just one more night, Mary. You can do this. Just one more night." But she didn't believe her own words. They had nowhere else to go. The little money Mary had managed to scrape together from selling her husband John's wedding ring, the last piece of him she had left, was gone. She had used it to buy Christmas lights and a single gift for Ethan, hoping to give him a moment of happiness before everything fell apart. The world around her, across the street, warm golden lights spilled out from the windows of cozy homes. Mary could hear faint laughter and the clinking of glasses as families gathered around Christmas trees, exchanging gifts and stories. She imagined what it must be like to be inside one of those houses, to feel the warmth of a fireplace, to share a meal with loved ones, to see Ethan's face light up with joy as he opened a present. But that wasn't her reality. A family passed by, their cheerful chatter echoing in the still night. They didn't notice her sitting there on the bench, clutching her son like a lifeline. They were too busy talking about their plans for the morning, presents, breakfast, and a big family dinner. She wanted to call out to them, to beg for help, but the words wouldn't come. She was too proud to ask, too tired to fight. She looked down at Ethan, his small face pale from the cold, his breath coming out in tiny puffs. He stirred slightly, murmuring in his sleep. "I'm sorry, baby," Mary whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." She thought about the promises she had made to him, promises she couldn't keep. She had told him they would have a Christmas like the ones in his drawings, bright lights, a feast, and gifts under a tree. But all she could give him was a string of cheap lights, a second-hand art set, and the bitter reality of their situation. Her stomach twisted as she remembered the ring she had sold. She had clung to that ring for 5 years, wearing it on a chain around her neck, close to her heart. It was her last connection to John, the man who had loved her, the man who had promised they would face life's challenges together. Now it was gone, and she had nothing left. The breaking point. The cold seeped into her bones, and Mary felt her head grow heavy. She tried to stay awake, but exhaustion was winning. Her eyelids drooped as the sounds around her blurred. The laughter of strangers, the soft crunch of footsteps in the snow, the distant toll of a church bell. She thought she heard someone calling her name, but she couldn't be sure. "John," she murmured, barely audible. "I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry." Her vision blurred, the world tilting around her. She felt herself slipping, the weight of her failures dragging her down. And then everything went dark. The sound of Ethan's soft breathing filled the cramped, cold apartment. Mary Harper sat by the dimly lit window, clutching a steaming mug of tea, though it did little to warm her hands. Outside, the streets of Michigan were alive with the sights and sounds of Christmas. Strings of golden lights twinkled along the rooftops, children laughed as they ran through the snow, and carolers sang cheerful tunes outside warmly lit homes. Inside Mary's apartment, however, it was a different story. The room was eerily quiet, broken only by the occasional creak of the old radiator struggling to heat the space. A small, bare Christmas tree stood in the corner. Ethan had decorated it with paper stars he had made from old magazines, his handwriting scrawled on each one. Believe, hope, love. Earlier that evening, Ethan had tugged on Mary's hand, his wide brown eyes filled with curiosity. "Mom," he asked softly, "will we ever have a Christmas tree with real lights? Just once?" Mary's chest tightened. She had forced herself to smile, ruffling his dark hair. "Someday, sweetheart. I promise." Ethan had nodded, satisfied with her answer. He returned to his makeshift decorations, carefully taping them to the tree with his small hands. He didn't ask for much, never had, but Mary could see the longing in his eyes. He wanted what every child wanted, to feel the magic of Christmas, even if just for one night. After Ethan had gone to bed, Mary sat by the window, staring out at the glowing lights that adorned the houses across the street. Each twinkle seemed to mock her, reminding her of all the things she couldn't give her son. She looked down at the silver chain around her neck, her fingers brushing against the wedding ring that hung from it. And it had been John's ring, a simple but beautiful token of their love. She remembered the day he had slid it onto her finger, his voice steady and full of promise. "This is forever, Mary. Through the good and the bad, we'll always have each other." But forever hadn't lasted as long as they'd hoped. 5 years ago, a slick road and a patch of black ice had stolen John from her. He had been on his way home from work, planning to surprise her with takeout from their favorite diner, when his car spun out of control. By the time the paramedics arrived, it was too late. Mary had clung to the ring ever since, wearing it close to her heart as a reminder of the man she had loved and the life they had built together. It was her anchor, her connection to a happier time. But now, as she stared at the ring, she felt a pang of guilt. Her son was asleep in the next room, bundled in blankets to keep warm because the radiator barely worked. There was no food in the fridge, no money to pay the overdue bills, and certainly no way to give Ethan the Christmas he deserved. The ring was all she had left of John, but it was also the only thing of value in the entire apartment. Mary picked up the ring, turning it over in her hands. The silver band glinted faintly in the dim light, its surface worn smooth from years of wear. "I'm sorry, John," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what else to do." She had thought about selling the ring before, but each time she couldn't bring herself to do it. It felt like a betrayal, like letting go of the last piece of John she had. But tonight, as she looked around the apartment, the peeling wallpaper, the empty cupboards, the small tree with its paper stars, she realized she didn't have a choice. Ethan deserved something, anything, to make this Christmas special. If selling the ring meant she could buy him a string of lights or a small gift, then so be it. The next morning, Mary dressed in her warmest coat, though it was threadbare and no match for the icy wind outside. She slipped the ring into her pocket and kissed Ethan's forehead before leaving. "Where are you going, Mom?" he asked sleepily, rubbing his eyes. "Just out to run some errands," she replied, forcing a smile. "I'll be back soon." Ethan nodded and curled up under the blankets, his small frame almost disappearing beneath them. Mary's footsteps crunched against the snow as she made her way to Joe's pawn shop. The small, cluttered store stood at the corner of Main Street, its neon sign flickering weakly in the gray morning light. When she stepped inside, the warmth of the shop hit her like a wave, and she paused for a moment, letting it sink into her frozen limbs. Joe, the shop's owner, looked up from behind the counter. He was a stout man in his 50s with kind eyes and a gruff demeanor. "Mary," he said, surprised. "What brings you here?" Wordlessly, she pulled the ring from her pocket and placed it on the counter. Joe's expression softened as he recognized it. "This is John's, isn't it?" he asked quietly. Mary nodded, her throat tightening. "I need the money, Joe. For Ethan." Joe hesitated, picking up the ring and examining it under the light. "Mary, are you sure about this? This isn't just a ring." "I don't have a choice," she said, her voice cracking. "Please, Joe, just tell me what it's worth." Joe sighed and opened the cash drawer. "It's not worth much, but I'll give you $200 for it. It's all I can do." Mary took the money with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered. Joe watched her as she turned to leave, his brow furrowed with concern. "Take care of yourself, Mary," he said softly. She nodded, unable to speak, and walked out into the snow. With the money, Mary bought a small string of Christmas lights and a second-hand art set for Ethan. That evening, they decorated the tree together. The weak glow of the lights filled the room with a warmth that seemed almost magical. Ethan's face lit up as he placed the final paper star on the tree. "Look, Mom! It's just like the ones in the movies." Mary forced a smile, her heart heavy with guilt. The sight of Ethan's joy was worth the sacrifice, but the empty space on her neck where the ring had once hung was a constant reminder of what she had lost. After Ethan fell asleep that night, Mary sat alone by the tree, staring at the flickering lights. She clasped her hands together, her fingers still cold despite the heat from the radiator. "Please," she whispered into the stillness. "If there's anything out there, Santa, God, anyone, please help us. I can't do this alone anymore." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands, letting the tears come. Little did she know, her prayer would soon be answered in a way she could never have imagined. Mary sat in the dim corner of the small apartment, her hands trembling as she clutched the chain around her neck. The tiny tree Ethan had decorated stood in the corner, its bare branches holding handmade ornaments made from torn pages of an old magazine. He had written hopeful words on each decoration: believe, love, family. There were no lights on the tree, just the faint glow of the street lamp outside filtering through the window. The silence in the room felt oppressive, broken only by the soft sound of Ethan's steady breathing as he slept under a pile of mismatched blankets. Mary's mind wandered, carried away by the weight of her thoughts. As she sat there in the cold, memories of her past life began to surface. She allowed herself to remember a time when things were different, when life had felt full of promise and possibility. Years ago, Mary had been working as a waitress at a small diner outside Detroit. She was 22, balancing her long shifts with evening classes at the local community college where she was studying to become a teacher. Her dream was simple: to build a life where she could inspire young minds and make a difference in the world. John had walked into her life on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday. The bell above the diner door jingled, and Mary glanced up to see a young man in a grease-stained jumpsuit. He looked tired, his dark hair messy from the day's work, but there was a kindness in his eyes that caught her attention. "Coffee, black, and maybe a slice of apple pie if it's fresh," he had said with a small smile. Mary chuckled softly, grabbing the coffee pot. "It's fresh enough. At least I haven't heard it complain yet." John laughed, a warm, genuine sound, and Mary felt a spark of something she couldn't quite name. Over the next few weeks, John became a regular at the diner. He always sat at the counter, ordering the same thing: coffee and pie. Mary found herself looking forward to his visits, her heart fluttering whenever she saw him walk through the door. One rainy evening, after the last customers had left, John lingered at the counter while Mary wiped it down. "You work too hard," he said, his voice tinged with concern. Mary shrugged, her smile faint. "Bills don't pay themselves." "You should let someone take you out," John said, leaning forward slightly. "Give yourself a break." Mary raised an eyebrow, surprised by his boldness. "Are you offering?" John grinned, his confidence faltering just slightly. "Maybe I am." Mary laughed softly, her cheeks flushing. "Well, maybe I'll let you." Their first date was simple: a walk in the park, followed by ice cream at a little stand by the river. John wasn't flashy or extravagant, but he made Mary feel like the most important person in the world. They talked for hours about their dreams, their fears, and the kind of life they wanted to build. "I want a house with a big yard," John said, his eyes lighting up. "A place where our kids can run around and make a mess without anyone yelling at them." Mary smiled, imagining the scene. "And a big Christmas tree," she added, "with lights and ornaments and gifts piled underneath." John nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, a place where it feels like magic every day." For the first time in a long while, Mary felt like that dream was possible. Their relationship grew quickly. John was steady, hard-working, and endlessly supportive. He wasn't the kind of man who made grand promises, but when he said he would do something, he always followed through. Mary loved that about him. One chilly autumn afternoon, John took Mary on a surprise trip to the park where they'd had their first date. The leaves had turned vibrant shades of red and gold, and the air was crisp and filled with the faint scent of wood smoke. As they strolled along the winding path, John suddenly stopped and turned to face her. "Mary?" he said, his voice unusually serious. "What is it?" she asked, her heart skipping a beat. John reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. He opened it to reveal a simple silver ring. its surface catching the light of the setting sun. "I don't have much," he said, his voice steady, "but I know that I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in Mary's eyes as she nodded, unable to speak. John slipped the ring onto her finger, and for a moment the world seemed to stand still. "This is forever," he said softly. "Through the good and the bad, we'll always have each other." They married a year later in a small church surrounded by their closest friends and family. It was a modest ceremony, but to Mary it felt like a fairy tale. She remembered the way John's hands trembled as he slid the ring onto her finger and the way his voice had cracked as he said his vows. Their life together wasn't extravagant, but it was filled with love. They rented a small apartment and worked hard to save for their future. It shattered on the tiled floor, the sound echoing through the room. The homeowner, a woman with perfectly styled hair and an expensive dress, rushed in. "What happened?" she demanded, her tone sharp. "I'm so sorry," Mary stammered, her cheeks flushing. "It was an accident. I'll pay for it." "With what money?" the woman interrupted, her eyes narrowing. "You're lucky I don't fire you right now." Mary swallowed hard, biting back tears. She apologized again and spent the next hour cleaning up the mess. When she left that day, she couldn't shake the humiliation she felt. Despite everything, Ethan remained her beacon of light. He never complained, never asked for more than she could give. Instead, he focused on the little things, his drawings, their late-night talks, and the stories Mary told him about a better future. "Do you think Santa will come this year?" he asked one night as they lay under the blankets. Mary hesitated, her heart breaking a little. "Maybe," she said softly. "You just have to believe." Ethan nodded, his eyes shining with hope. "I believe, Mom. I really do." Mary turned away, tears streaming down her face. As Christmas approached, the weight of their struggles seemed heavier than ever. Mary's employer at the diner, Mrs. Green, had cut her hours, saying business was slow during the winter months. That meant even less money to cover their mounting expenses. Her landlord had already given her 2 warnings about the overdue rent. Mary knew it was only a matter of time before he came knocking again, demanding payment she didn't have. One night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Mary sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of bills in front of her. Her hands trembled as she picked up the silver chain around her neck, the weight of John's wedding ring pressing against her palm. She had held on to the ring for 5 years, refusing to part with it no matter how desperate things got. It was the last piece of John she had, a symbol of their love and the life they had built together. But now, as she looked around the apartment, the peeling wallpaper, the empty cupboards, the bare tree in the corner, she realized she didn't have a choice. The ring was all she had left, but it was also the only thing of value in the entire apartment. "I'm sorry, John," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know what else to do." Tears streamed down her face as she slipped the chain over her head, holding the ring tightly in her hand. She didn't know how much she could get for it, but she hoped it would be enough to give Ethan the Christmas he deserved. One with lights, a small meal, and maybe even a gift. As she sat there in the darkness, clutching the ring, Mary felt a mixture of guilt and determination. She had promised John she would take care of Ethan, no matter what, and she intended to keep that promise. The morning was colder than usual, the frost clinging stubbornly to the windows of the apartment. Mary sat at the small, rickety table, staring at the silver wedding ring lying in the center. It glinted faintly in the weak light streaming through the curtain, a small but painful reminder of everything she had lost. This was it. The last piece of John. Mary closed her eyes, the memories of their life together flooding her mind. She could still hear his laughter, still feel the warmth of his hand in hers. The ring wasn't just a symbol of their marriage. It was a lifeline that had carried her through the darkest days after his death. Her heart ached as she reached out to pick it up. The cool metal felt heavy in her hand, as if it carried the weight of all the promises they had made to each other. Promises to face life's challenges together. Promises she now had to face alone. But now, it was also the only thing standing between her and complete hopelessness. She wrapped the ring in a scrap of cloth, tucking it carefully into her coat pocket. As she got ready to leave, she glanced at Ethan, still fast asleep under the layers of blankets that barely kept the cold at bay. "Mom?" he mumbled, stirring slightly. "Shh," Mary said softly, kneeling beside him. "Go back to sleep, sweetheart. I'll be back soon." Ethan nodded groggily, his small face disappearing into the blanket. Mary kissed his forehead, her heart heavy with guilt and determination. Joe's pawn shop was just a few blocks away, but the walk felt endless. The snow crunched under Mary's worn boots, and the icy wind cut through her thin coat. Her fingers trembled as she shoved them into her pockets, but it wasn't just the cold that made her hands shake. Every step felt like a betrayal. The bell above the door jingled as Mary pushed it open. Inside, the warmth of the shop hit her like a wave, but it did little to calm her nerves. The shop smelled faintly of leather and dust, the air thick with the quiet desperation of people who had come here to part with their most precious possessions. Joe looked up from behind the counter, his brows furrowing when he saw her. "Mary," he said, surprised. "What brings you here?" Mary didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her pocket, pulling out the small cloth bundle. Her hands shook as she unwrapped it, revealing the silver ring. Joe's expression softened as he recognized it. "This is John's, isn't it?" Mary nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I need the money, Joe. For Ethan." Joe hesitated, his kind eyes studying her face. "Are you sure about this? I know what this ring means to you." Mary swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I don't have a choice." Joe sighed, picking up the ring and examining it under the light. "It's not worth much, but I'll give you $200. It's more than I should, but I want to help." Mary took the money with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. Joe hesitated again, then added, "If you ever need anything, Mary, you know where to find me." She nodded, unable to speak, and quickly left the shop before the tears could fall. The walk home felt even colder than the walk there. Mary clutched the cash tightly, her heart heavy with a mixture of relief and grief. She had done what she needed to do, but the emptiness in her chest was unbearable. When she returned to the apartment, Ethan was awake, sitting at the table with his sketchbook. His face lit up when he saw her. "Mom, look," he said, holding up a new drawing. It was another picture of a big house with a Christmas tree glowing brightly in the window. Mary forced a smile, her throat tightening. "It's beautiful, sweetheart." Ethan grinned, returning to his sketching. Mary placed the money on the counter, staring at it for a long moment. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy a few things. Some Christmas lights, a small meal, and maybe even a gift for Ethan. That evening, Mary took Ethan to the small store down the street. He held her hand tightly as they walked through the aisles, his eyes wide with excitement. Mary let him pick out a string of colorful Christmas lights and a small turkey from the freezer section. She also slipped a small gift into the cart, a second-hand art set she had spotted on a shelf. When they got home, Ethan couldn't wait to decorate the tree. He carefully untangled the lights while Mary cooked their modest dinner. The smell of the turkey roasting in the oven filled the apartment, bringing a warmth that Mary hadn't felt in a long time. "Ready, Mom?" Ethan called, his voice full of excitement. Mary joined him by the tree, helping him string the lights around the branches. When they plugged them in, the colorful bulbs flickered to life, casting a soft glow across the room. "It's perfect," Ethan said, his eyes shining with joy. Mary smiled, but the lump in her throat made it hard to speak. She watched as Ethan placed one of his handmade paper stars at the top of the tree, his small hands steady with concentration. "Now it's done," he declared proudly. After dinner, Ethan opened his gift. When he saw the art set, his face lit up with a smile so bright it made Mary's heart ache. "Thank you, Mom," he said, throwing his arms around her. "You're welcome, sweetheart," she whispered, holding him close. For a moment, everything felt okay. The glow of the lights, the warmth of Ethan's hug, and the sound of his laughter made the world seem a little brighter. Later that night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Mary sat alone by the tree. The colorful lights reflected off the window, casting faint patterns on the walls. She reached up to her neck, her fingers brushing against the empty spot where the ring had once hung. "I'm sorry, John," she whispered into the stillness. "I hope you understand." Her voice broke, and the tears she had been holding back finally spilled over. She had done what she needed to do for Ethan, but the weight of the sacrifice felt heavier than anything she had ever carried. As she sat there, the lights from the tree glowing softly behind her, she allowed herself a small moment of relief. Ethan was happy, and that was all that mattered. The weight of the days leading up to Christmas bore down on Mary Harper like a physical force. Each night, she lay awake in the dark, unable to quiet her mind. The small string of lights Ethan had picked out flickered weakly in the corner, their muted glow a faint reminder of the bittersweet moments they had shared decorating the tree. But those moments felt distant now. Mary's thoughts were consumed by a looming dread, bills she couldn't pay, a landlord growing increasingly impatient, and now the loss of her cleaning job at the Connolly household. Her worries had begun manifesting physically. Nights were filled with tossing and turning, her chest tight as though the weight of her failures were pressing down on her. She would sit up in the middle of the night, wrapping herself in the thin blanket as she gazed out the window. The frost-covered glass reflected her haggard face back at her, a face she barely recognized anymore. Ethan, meanwhile, slept peacefully on the other mattress. Mary watched his small chest rise and fall with each breath, finding a small shred of solace in his innocence. His world was still a place of dreams and hope, untainted by the harsh realities she faced. The days felt just as endless. After losing her job at the Connollys, Mary had spent every waking moment trying to find new work. She knocked on doors, visited other homes, and left notes with her contact information wherever she could. But most people were already settled with their housekeepers or weren't hiring during the holidays. She even approached Joe at the pawn shop, hoping he might know someone who needed help. Joe offered her a job cleaning the back room of the store for a few hours, but the pay was barely enough to buy groceries, let alone cover rent. Still, Mary accepted gratefully. The tension in the apartment grew as the week went on. The little money she had from selling John's ring was nearly gone. The rent deadline loomed like a dark cloud over her, and she knew her landlord, Mr. Burke, wasn't bluffing this time. One morning, the inevitable knock came at the door. Mary opened it cautiously, her heart sinking when she saw Mr. Burke standing there with a clipboard in hand. His expression was firm, but not unkind. "Mary," he began, "I gave you as much time as I could. I'm sorry, but if you don't pay the rent by the end of the week, you'll have to vacate." Mary swallowed hard, nodding. "I understand," she said quietly, though her voice trembled. Burke hesitated for a moment. "I know it's not easy, especially this time of year. If there's anything I can do—" Mary forced a smile. "Thank you, but I'll figure it out." He nodded and left, leaving Mary standing in the doorway, her shoulders slumping under the weight of his words. That night, as Ethan slept, Mary sat at the small table with the stack of unpaid bills. She spread them out in front of her, the numbers blurring together as tears filled her eyes. There was no way to make it work, not without a miracle. Her hands trembled as she buried her face in them, the exhaustion and despair finally bubbling over. "I don't know what to do anymore," she whispered into the stillness. "I've tried everything and it's still not enough." Her thoughts drifted to John. She imagined him sitting across from her, his steady presence calming her panic like it used to. She could almost hear his voice. "We'll get through this, Mary, one step at a time." But John wasn't there, and she was tired of carrying the burden alone. The days dragged on. Mary managed to scrape together a few more dollars from the odd jobs Joe sent her way, but it was barely enough to buy bread and milk. Each time she handed over cash at the grocery store, she calculated how long the food would last and whether it was better to skip meals herself so Ethan could have more. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Ethan spoke up, his voice tentative. "Mom," he began, looking down at his plate, "what happens if we can't live here anymore?" Mary froze, her fork hovering in midair. She hadn't realized he had picked up on the tension. "We'll figure it out," she said softly, setting her fork down. "Will Santa help us?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with quiet hope. Mary's chest tightened. She wanted to believe it too, but the reality was far less magical. "Maybe," she said, forcing a smile, "but no matter what happens, we'll be okay, I promise." The week crept closer to its end, and Mary's anxiety reached a breaking point. The landlord's deadline was a looming shadow, and her desperate prayers for a miracle seemed to go unanswered. Each night, she lay awake, her thoughts spiraling into panic. What if we have to leave? Where will we go? The cold seeped into her bones, and the emptiness in the apartment felt like a physical presence. One particularly frigid night, Mary couldn't take it anymore. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Ethan, and wrapped herself in her coat. She stepped outside into the icy air, her breath forming small clouds as she exhaled. The streets were quiet, blanketed in snow. She walked aimlessly, her boots crunching against the frozen ground. The world felt vast and empty, and Mary felt smaller than she ever had before. She found herself standing in front of the church down the street, its tall spire silhouetted against the starry sky. The doors were open, and a faint light spilled out into the night. Mary hesitated before stepping inside. The warmth hit her instantly, and she stood there for a moment, letting it soak into her frozen limbs. The church was empty except for a few flickering candles and a nativity scene near the altar. She walked slowly to one of the pews and sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She hadn't prayed in years, not since John's death, but tonight she didn't know what else to do. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "If there's anyone listening, God, Santa, anyone, please help us. I don't know how much longer I can keep going." Her tears fell freely now, soaking into the worn fabric of her coat. For the first time in a long time, Mary allowed herself to let go. She cried for John, for Ethan, for the life they had lost, and for the future she wasn't sure she could give her son. When she finally left the church, the streets were still quiet, the snow falling softly around her. She didn't have answers, but she felt a tiny sliver of peace, as though the weight on her chest had lifted just slightly. The next morning, Mary woke to Ethan tugging on her sleeve. "Mom, look," he said excitedly, pointing out the window. The snow outside sparkled in the early sunlight, and in the distance, the faint sound of carolers drifted through the air. "It's like magic," Ethan said, his eyes wide with wonder. Mary smiled, her heart aching with love for her son. No matter what happened, she would find a way to keep that light in his eyes. "Maybe," she said softly, pulling him into a hug. "Maybe magic does exist after all." The knock came late in the afternoon. It was sharp and deliberate, the sound echoing through the small apartment. Mary froze, her heart pounding. She knew who it was before she even opened the door. Taking a deep breath, she walked to the door and opened it slowly. Mr. Burke stood there, his expression stern but not unkind. He held a clipboard in one hand and a set of papers in the other. "Mary," he said, his voice firm, "I gave you until today to pay the rent. I'm sorry, but I can't give you any more time." Mary's throat tightened. "Please, Mr. Burke," she said, her voice breaking. "I just need a little more time. I'm doing everything I can." "I understand," he interrupted, his tone softening slightly. "I know you've tried, but I have other tenants waiting for this space. I have to follow through." Tears welled in Mary's eyes as she glanced back at Ethan, who sat quietly drawing at the table, unaware of what was happening. "Where are we supposed to go?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Burke hesitated, his expression wavering for a moment, but then he shook his head. "I'm sorry, Mary. I really am." He handed her the papers and stepped back. "You need to be out by tonight." Mary closed the door slowly, her hands trembling as she clutched the eviction notice. For a long moment she stood still, staring blankly at the wall. It felt like the ground beneath her had disappeared, leaving her floating in an endless void of uncertainty. Ethan looked up from his drawing, his innocent face filled with curiosity. "Mom, What's wrong?" Mary forced a smile, though her eyes were brimming with tears. "Nothing, sweetheart," she said softly. "We're just going to take a little trip tonight." "A trip?" Ethan asked, his face lighting up. "Where?" "Somewhere new," Mary replied, her voice trembling slightly. "We're going to be okay, I promise." As the sun set and the cold winter night crept in, Mary packed their few belongings into a single bag. Ethan clung to his sketchbook, tucking it under his arm like a precious treasure. Mary wrapped him in his heaviest coat, tying his scarf snugly around his neck before putting on her own. The apartment, once filled with their laughter and struggles, now felt like a hollow shell. Mary glanced at the little tree they had decorated together, its lights flickering softly in the darkened room. She leaned down and kissed Ethan's forehead. "Ready, sweetheart?" Ethan nodded, holding her hand tightly as they stepped out into the frigid night. They walked for what felt like hours, the cold biting into Mary's skin despite her coat. Ethan stayed close to her side, his small hand clutching hers tightly. Finally, they reached a quiet park. A single bench sat under the soft glow of a street lamp, the snow around it untouched. Mary led Ethan to the bench, brushing off the snow before sitting down. She pulled him onto her lap, wrapping her arms around him to shield him from the cold. Ethan snuggled into her, his voice small. "Mom, is this where we're staying tonight?" Mary hesitated, her throat tightening. "Just for tonight," she said softly. "It's like camping, remember? An adventure." Ethan nodded, his trust unwavering. "Okay, Mom. I like adventures." Mary held him closer, her tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now, all she could do was keep him warm and safe. As the wind howled softly through the empty park, Mary looked up at the dark sky, the faint twinkle of stars barely visible through the haze of city lights. "Please," she whispered into the night, her voice trembling, "if there's anyone out there, please help us." The street lamp cast a soft golden glow around them as Mary closed her eyes, exhaustion and despair finally overtaking her. Ethan's breathing slowed as he drifted off to sleep in her arms. The world around them grew still, the cold night pressing in, but Mary refused to let go of the faint glimmer of hope that something, anything, might change. The biting cold cut through Mary's coat as she huddled on the bench, clutching Ethan tightly. The street lamp above them flickered faintly, its golden glow casting long shadows on the snowy ground. Ethan had fallen asleep in her arms, his small body curled against hers for warmth. Mary stared into the darkness, her mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. She had no answers. The faint hum of a car passing in the distance broke the silence of the night, but Mary barely noticed. Her head tilted back, her eyes scanning the empty sky. Was anyone listening? She thought. "John," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know how much longer I can do this." The wind picked up, rustling the branches of the nearby trees. Mary shifted to shield Ethan from the icy gust, her hands numb from the cold. Just as her despair threatened to overwhelm her, she heard the crunch of footsteps in the snow. Her body tensed. She turned her head slowly, her heart pounding as the sound grew louder. A shadow emerged from the darkness, the faint outline of a figure approaching. "Excuse me," a deep, steady voice called out. Mary instinctively tightened her grip on Ethan, her mind racing with fear and caution. The figure stepped into the light of the street lamp, revealing an elderly man with a long white beard and a cane in one hand. He wore a thick coat and a scarf wrapped tightly around his neck. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said gently, his eyes kind. "I saw you sitting here with your boy and thought you might need some help." Mary hesitated, her instincts warning her to be cautious. "We're fine," she said quickly, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. The man smiled, his expression warm. "It doesn't look like you're fine, young lady," he said softly. "It's too cold to be out here tonight. Do you have somewhere to go?" Mary glanced down at Ethan, her heart sinking. She shook her head slowly. "No," she admitted, her voice barely audible. The man nodded, his expression thoughtful. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small thermos. "Here," he said, holding it out to her. "It's hot cocoa. It's not much, but it'll help warm you up." Mary hesitated for a moment before accepting it. The warmth of the thermos against her freezing hands was almost enough to make her cry. "Thank you," she murmured, unscrewing the lid and taking a small sip. The man watched her for a moment before speaking again. "You shouldn't be out here tonight. Come with me. I have a warm place where you and your son can rest." Mary's grip on Ethan tightened. She didn't know this man, and the idea of trusting a stranger felt risky, but the kindness in his eyes and the genuine concern in his voice made her pause. "I don't know," she said hesitantly. The man smiled again, his expression gentle. "I understand your hesitation, but I promise, I only want to help." He gestured to the cane in his hand. "I'm not exactly in a position to cause any trouble." Mary glanced down at Ethan, who stirred slightly in his sleep. She knew she couldn't spend another night like this, not with the temperatures dropping even further. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "We'll come with you." The man led them down the quiet, snow-covered streets to a small house tucked away at the edge of the park. The warm glow of the porch light welcomed them, and Mary felt a small sense of relief as they stepped inside. The house was modest but cozy. A fire crackled in the fireplace, filling the room with a comforting warmth. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner, its simple decorations glowing softly in the firelight. "You can set your boy down on the couch," the man said, motioning to the plush sofa near the fireplace. Mary gently placed Ethan on the couch, covering him with a blanket the man handed her. She brushed a strand of hair from Ethan's forehead, her heart aching with love for her son. "Thank you," she said, turning to the man. He waved her thanks away. "No need for that," he said, settling into an armchair. "My name's Henry, by the way." "Mary," she replied. Henry nodded, his eyes warm. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mary. Now, why don't you sit down and tell me how you ended up out there in the cold?" As Mary sat by the fire, she found herself opening up to Henry in a way she hadn't expected. She told him about John, about Ethan, and about the struggles that had led them to that bench in the park. Henry listened quietly, his expression kind and understanding. When she finished, she wiped at her eyes, embarrassed by her tears. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to burden you." Henry shook his head. "You're not a burden, Mary," he said firmly. "Life isn't easy, and sometimes we all need a little help." He stood and walked to a cabinet, pulling out a small envelope. He handed it to her, his gaze steady. "This is for you." Mary opened the envelope cautiously, her breath catching when she saw the stack of cash inside. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "Why would you do this for us?" Henry smiled, his eyes twinkling. "Because someone once helped me when I was in need," he said simply, "and now it's my turn to pay it forward." Mary stared at him, her heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Henry reached out and patted her shoulder gently. "Merry Christmas, Mary," he said softly. "And remember, kindness has a way of coming back around." As Mary sat by the fire that night, watching Ethan sleep peacefully on the couch, she felt a warmth in her heart that she hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that things might finally get better. She glanced at Henry, who was quietly tending to the fire, and whispered, "Maybe miracles do happen after all." The morning sun cast a soft golden light through the windows, warming the room with a sense of hope. Mary stirred from her fitful sleep, the weight of the past few days still heavy on her shoulders. She looked over at Ethan, who was peacefully curled up on the couch, tucked in with blankets Henry had provided. The comfort of being safe, warm, and together for the first time in weeks brought a sense of relief that Mary had almost forgotten existed. Her eyes wandered to the Christmas tree in the corner. The small, simple tree glowed warmly under the soft light, surrounded by Ethan's colorful drawings and the faint smell of pine. It wasn't much, but in that moment, it was everything. She thought back to the cold park bench the night before, the desperation she had felt, and the kindness of a stranger. Henry had opened his home to them, offering not just shelter, but compassion in a way that Mary hadn't experienced in a long time. It had been a miracle, one she had never expected. As Mary prepared breakfast, her hands still shaking from the events of the last few days, she felt a shift in her heart. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to relax, to let go of the constant worry that had consumed her for so long. She looked over at Ethan, still asleep, clutching his art set. He was blissfully unaware of the struggle she had faced or the pain she had carried alone. But now, things were different. Mary was starting to believe again. In kindness, in miracles, in the possibility of a better future for her son. A few hours later, as Mary sat by the fire, sipping a cup of coffee, there was a knock at the door. Her heart skipped a beat. She had hoped for a quiet day, but the sound of footsteps in the snow outside made her feel uneasy. She opened the door, and, to her surprise, it wasn't anyone she expected. It was Mr. Burke, the landlord. "Mary," he said, his tone gentler than she had ever heard it. "I've been thinking." Mary stiffened. She didn't know what to expect. She had braced herself for more bad news. "I'm sorry about how things turned out," Mr. Burke continued. "I shouldn't have rushed into things. You've been through enough, and I realize I didn't give you a fair chance. So—" He hesitated for a moment. "I've arranged with the office to extend your lease. You don't have to leave. You can stay." Mary stared at him, disbelief crossing her face. "Wait, what? Are you serious?" "I am," he said, handing her an envelope. "I've made sure the overdue balance is forgiven for this month, and I've arranged for a payment plan. It's a Christmas miracle, really." Mary was speechless. She looked at the envelope in her hands, barely able to comprehend what was happening. After everything, after all the pain and the tears, someone had decided to give her and Ethan another chance. Mr. Burke had found it in himself to be kind, to be understanding. I don't know what to say." Mary stammered, still in shock. "I can't believe it." Mr. Burke gave a small smile. "You don't have to say anything. Just take it as a chance to move forward, Mary. I've been hard on you, but I see now that sometimes life throws people curveballs, and we need to help each other get through them." As Mr. Burke left, Mary stood in the doorway, the envelope still in her hand, her mind reeling. It was as though everything had changed in an instant. From the deepest despair, a door had opened, a chance to start again. She closed the door and walked back to the living room, her heart light for the first time in a long time. She kneeled beside Ethan, who was now awake, his big brown eyes filled with curiosity. "Mom," he said softly, "what's wrong? You look happy." Mary laughed softly, wiping away the tears she hadn't noticed had begun to fall. "I am happy, sweetheart," she said, pulling him into a hug. "We're going to be okay. We have a home. We're safe. And it's Christmas Eve." Ethan's face lit up with the brightest smile she had ever seen. "Does that mean Santa's coming?" Mary chuckled, the sound filling the room like music. "Yes, sweetheart. Santa is definitely coming." As they sat together by the fire, Mary reflected on the events that had brought them here, the struggle, the fear, and the pain. But also the kindness, the unexpected help, and the small miracles that had made everything possible. It wasn't just the money or the roof over their heads that mattered. It was the belief that, no matter how bad things got, there was always the possibility of a better tomorrow. And it was the belief that kindness, no matter how small, could change someone's life. That sometimes even the most unexpected places and people could offer a lifeline when you needed it most. As Mary looked at Ethan, watching him smile as he played with his new art set, she couldn't help but feel a sense of deep gratitude. They had made it through, together. This Christmas would be different, not because of the presents or the perfect meal, but because it was filled with the warmth of love, kindness, and hope. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever faced difficult times or felt like the world was too much to handle, just remember that miracles happen. Sometimes they come in the form of a stranger's kindness, a second chance, or simply the belief that things will get better. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more uplifting stories. And if you've experienced a miracle or kindness in your life, we'd love to hear about it. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Stay hopeful, and always remember, the best is yet to come.